If you've ever been to a comic book convention, you're often overwhelmed with the amount of selection. Comic book vendors from all across the United States go to venues like the Emerald City Comic Con and the San Diego Comic Con to sell their books, collections purchased from estates, collections found in attics, the whole works. There's always something to be found at American comic book conventions. From the Golden Age onwards, books can be found not only at these venues, but in excess. Canada's largest comic book convention is FanExpo Canada, which is held at the end of August in Toronto, Ontario. I have been on and off going to the show since 2010, and I have seen many vendors come and go from across the country. Save for a handful of American vendors, it's mostly a Canadian show. The thing is, many American dealers come with books Canadians don't see all that often, and unfortunately for Canadians, it comes at a higher price. And no, I'm not just referring to the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. For my American viewers, you may rarely find a book with a Canadian price variant, and arguably they are rare, but they are mostly rare for American collectors. Obviously that's not entirely the case, but I'll drill down into this later. However, what if I were to tell you common American Golden Age books like Adventures into the Unknown or Crime Does Not Pay, books you regularly see at conventions or shops, are rarities in Canada? Certainly one could argue it's about relativity. No, not the Einstein theory, I'm talking about relative markets, because of course Canadian price variants would be more abundant in Canada rather than America. But why can't Canadians find books like Adventures into the Unknown at their comic conventions or local shops in abundance? In modern times, mostly all comic books from all major publishers are made in Canada. For being the connected neighbor to the north and the current source for comic books, with even the co-creator of the superhero Superman being Canadian, how did Canada get the shaft for comic books? Where did the Canadian price variant come from? Why does the comic book market stink in Canada? Steel yourselves as we explore a little slice of Canadiana. To really dig into the differences of the comic book markets, we can start all the way back to the OG superhero Superman. You may have heard of him, but in case you haven't, he is the first superhero in comics. He debuted in Action Comics #1, published in April of 1938. He was created by American-born writer Jerry Siegel and Canadian-born artist Joe Shuster. The debut of Superman kickstarted what would be known as the Golden Age of comic books, which would last until 1956. Superman's success brought in superheroes like Batman, who first appeared in May 1939 with Detective Comics #27, and Captain America, premiering in December of 1940 in Captain America Comics #1, a full year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, meaning the book premiered before the United States ever entered World War II. World War II occurred September 1st, 1939 until September 2nd, 1945. Canada officially entered the war 9 days after it started on September 10th, 1939. The United States entered on December 11, 1941. The war dramatically changed the landscape of the comic books in Canada during the Golden Age. In an interview with TV Ontario, aka TVO, an educational television channel in Canada, comic book historian Ivan Kosmarek stated that, prior to World War II, all the American comics were there on our newsstands. At the time, comics were tremendously popular. New superheroes such as Superman and Batman flew off the shelves. But in 1940, Canada's supply dried up. With World War II underway, the War Exchange Conservation Act of 1940 banned the import of pulp magazines and comic books. The purpose of Canada evoking the act was to preserve its currency for the war effort, essentially preventing non-essential purchases from leaving the country to keep money within Canada. As an aside, a positive part of the act was that it forced the creation of Canada's first comic book industry. It is argued Canada's first comic is Better Comics #1 from March of 1941. It features Iron Man, but not that Iron Man. Canada's Iron Man also had a similar origin story to the Submariner. But all of that and the history of Canadian comic books, however, is a topic to cover in a separate video. While the comics weren't on the shelves, Superman became available through newspapers published in Canada. My wife's grandmother had a bound copy of the Niagara Falls Evening Review from 1941, which had the daily newspaper for several months within it. Of course, I took some photos and will show you some of the Superman strips from that time. As for this one, look, I don't know, things were just different back then. Due to the absence of American comic books, Canadian comic books began cropping up, which meant new publishers such as Maple Leaf Publishing, Atom Publishing, Super Publishing, and Bell Features would come in swinging to fill the gaps with books like WoW Comics or the pulp Uncanny Tales. However, near the end of the war, in the summer of 1945, the Canadian government announced it was relaxing the ban on American publications, meaning the ever so popular American books were allowed back into Canada again. With the competing business, and because Canadian comics were mostly printed in black and white due to the war effort, many Canadian publishers dried up having to compete with the full color American comics. It was only a few years later, however, in 1947, when due to tariff threats, did Canada announce bans on particular American imports. Comic books were once again caught in the crossfire. This time, however, there was a loophole. Canadian publishers were allowed to license and print American comics to appear on Canadian newsstands. Not only was it more popular to reprint American media, but it was cheaper to acquire licenses to reprint stories rather than to create new ones in-house. Canadian companies such as Associated Weekly Newspapers and Superior Publishers teamed up with American companies such as American Comics Group and EC Comics to reprint many of their books for Canadians. While the artwork was mostly the same, advertisements were often different for the market. Here's a copy of Weird Science number 17 from 1953 from my personal collection. It is published by Superior and features a different ad on the back compared to its American counterpart. I also own a copy of Crime Does Not Pay number 73 from 1949, published by Super Publishing. Along with the index and Canadian-specific ads, you'll notice the cover also mentions it's the Canadian edition. This meant, though, in 1949, out of the 176 comic titles on Canadian newsstands, only 23 of them were truly Canadian comics. By 1951, the War Exchange Conservation Act was officially abolished, making it harder for Canadian publishers to survive from the influx of American comics. This meant there were fewer comic books on the shelves, as the reprinted American books were no longer able to be published by Canadian publishers. Both American and Canadian comic books suffered, with Superior being one of the last publishers left standing. But before that, there's two more events that caused the decline of Golden Age books in Canada. It all began due to a crime comic scare which started in November of 1948. A duo, aged 13 and 11, in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, shot at a car and killed its passenger. When authorities discovered they read crime comic books, there was a fear towards the books and a concern between the relation of comic books and juvenile delinquency. This story may seem similar to events like Columbine and Marilyn Manson. As such, in 1949, a bill to amend the criminal code in Canada was drafted by Member of Parliament Davy Fulton from British Columbia. The bill eventually passed, making it an offense to make, print, publish, distribute, or sell books with pictures depicting crimes, whether real or fictitiously. Yes, I am serious. Shortly thereafter, Canadian comic publishers created the Comic Magazine Industry Association of Canada, or CMIAC. The organization actively watched and censored comic books being published in Canada. The Canadian publisher Superior, however, defied the ban and decided to reprint books by EC Comics like my Weird Science number 17. The only concession Superior made was that Crime Suspense Stories was renamed Weird Suspense Stories. Superior, of course, made their own two horror comic books, Journey into Fear and Strange Mysteries. But Golden Age comic book collectors are likely familiar with psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, a book focused on how comic books infected children with violence and terrible thoughts. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. The final blow to Golden Age comics came to Canada when the United States Senate Subcommittee held a hearing on juvenile delinquency. Witnesses for the hearing included both Dr. Frederick Wertham and Canadian MP Davy Fulton. The result of the hearing in 1954 was the end of popular horror and crime comic books. Much like Canada's CMIAC, the Comics Magazine Association of America created the Comics Code Authority over 4 years after Canada's version was created. With the advent of the Comics Code Authority, many American comic book companies folded, and as such, Canadian publishers reprinting American books followed suit, including Superior Comics ultimately folding in 1956. The creation of the Comics Code Authority is also considered the official end of the Golden Age of comic books. The good times seem to be over. This all brings me back to the beginning of the video on how Canada got the short straw when it came to comic books. Golden Age books seem notoriously difficult to come across and are often only found in Canada when American vendors step into the ring. As someone who loves to collect Golden Age books, it pains me that they are not readily available in Canada. While Canadian variants do exist, much like their American counterparts, they are rare to come by, especially since Canada had a ban on quote-unquote delinquent comic books a few years before America. But it's important to note the distinction. Canadian variants, and Canadian price variants. My copy of Weird Science number 17 is a Canadian variant. Much like the American copy from EC, it too has a cover price of 10 cents. This is considered a Canadian edition of the book because, while it originated from an American publisher, they were reprinted in Canada. Makes sense, right? However, in late 1982 until 1988, during the Bronze and Modern Age of comics, Canadian price variants cropped up. For example, American books priced at 60 cents would be shown as 75 cents when sold in Canada. Here is a copy of my Uncanny X-Men number 171 from 1983 and an Uncanny X-Men 196 from 1985. While both are newsstand copies, as the barcode on the bottom signifies, they are actually the Canadian price variants. Compared to another book from the time, you can see the difference on how prices were distinguished on the cover. While both American and Canadian prints occurred at the same time, their distribution is what created the rarity of the books. Heading over to Canadian Price Variant Guide, or cpvpriceguide.com, they break down the distribution of Canadian price variants in comics. You'll see that roughly 2% of all printed books of a run, so say my Uncanny X-Men number 171, are Canadian price variants, with around 18% being newsstands and roughly 80% being direct editions. I'll have a link in the description below so you can see how they determine these percentages. As you can imagine, rarer print runs mean more expensive books. However, not all Canadian price variants are expensive. Unimportant books, like my Uncanny X-Men 171, aren't major key issues, and as such, there's not much to warrant a high price on the market. I picked my Canadian price variants up from dollar bins back in the day. However, much like quality newsstand copies of books, high-grade Canadian price variants can go for quite a bit. Newsstand books often go for more due to their scarcity and higher grades. Newsstand books were sold on newsstands after all. They were not taken care of as well as their direct edition counterparts. So if you take an already rare, high-quality newsstand comic book, and add it being a Canadian price variant with a print run of roughly 2% to choose from, they add together for the makings of a high-priced book. So how does this relate to the Canadian comic book market? Much like the Golden Age, Canada seemed to get the shaft for comic books with these variants too. Not only did Canadians have to pay more for the comic books, paying 75 cents instead of 60 cents, nowadays these quote-unquote rare Canadian books often sell for more than what normal newsstand books go for in the American market. Take for example G.I. Joe number 21. This book features the first appearance of Storm Shadow and is notable for not having any dialogue in the book. Popping over to cgcdata.com, you can see the difference between the graded American and Canadian prints as of February 2025. Unfortunately, CGC data does not differentiate newsstand editions. That being said, the number of books in the American market clearly eclipses the Canadian one. And while there's not much sales data for Canadian price variants, Cover Price does have some recorded sales for them with CGC graded 9.4s. In September of 2017, the CGC 9.4 Canadian price variant of this book went for $256. Unfortunately, I do not have data for newsstands, but an equivalent direct edition copy sold for $91 in January of 2018. In December of 2021, a Canadian price variant sold for $2,397. In May of 2021, a newsstand sold for $1,000, while a direct edition sold for $545 in the same month. All of these prices are in US dollars. These scarce books, while great for collectors, reinforce how difficult it is for Canadian collectors to enjoy the comic book hobby. Not only did Canadians miss out on the golden age of American comic books, but in later years, Canadians were charged more for comics, and now those very same expensive books are selling for even more in the aftermarket. And as I said, all of these prices were in US dollars. Canada has only been on par or has eclipsed the US dollar on two separate occasions. Once in 1972, as the Canadian government allowed it to float to fight inflation, and again in 2008 due to the Great Recession. At the time of writing this, the Canadian dollar has been around 70 to 71 cents on the US dollar, making it expensive for Canadians to buy books in American markets, not to mention the additional costs of shipping and duty. So why does the Canadian comic book collecting market stink? Well, it kinda does and it kinda doesn't. If anything, it's difficult competing with a significantly larger country south of its border. The books are there, but Canadians are just easily priced out, and that's also because the American market heavily influences the Canadian one. Americans are more willing to pay high dollar for Canadian price variants, and as such, the common price variant books in Canada can be more expensive. In a way, I kinda like to think the Canadian price variants as the Mark Jeweller variants of the North. But I digress. Canadians also missed out on the comic book craze in the 30s and 40s. Europe required Canada's immediate help during World War II, and that help came literally 5 months after the debut of Superman in Action Comics #1. There was no time for American comics to be a part of Canada. But none of this is really a complaint. As someone who enjoys the comic book collecting hobby, I have always had fun hunting for rare books and learning about the history between the US and Canada through the comic book medium. If anything, if you're a comic book collector in Canada, I feel you're playing the comic book collecting game, and like me, you're playing it on hard mode. Thank you all for watching and learning a bit more about Canada and comic books. I'll see you all in the next video.